All right, we're live. Welcome back to another episode of First of All. Super excited to be back. Sorry we missed you guys last week. COVID took us down, had a short little internet outage. So we missed last Monday, but I'm super excited to be back this Monday and have the opportunity to be able to speak to different ways that we can advocate for change. Right now is definitely a moment where we can recognize and we can see and we can actually articulate and really point out a lot of issues and a lot of problems that we see, especially within our healthcare infrastructure, problematic policies that help exacerbate health disparities and health problems, and especially right now, COVID-19, which tends to impact those populations that are most vulnerable. So right now is definitely a time to consider how we advocate for change across the board, but also particularly consider how we advocate for change within the school system. And how do we advocate for change for teens and for adolescents who are in school, who are also governed by policies that might be punitive or might be exclusionary or might be deleterious to their health or their mental health. And overall, maybe not have the impact that we intend to have, but might actually have more harm. And so over the course of these series, we've been recognizing in general, we have reasons why we cope. We have a slew of different reasons, a slew of different ways how we cope. And all of it's okay. The fact that we have reasons to cope is okay. And it's something we have to be honest about. It's not a matter of if, but when. And again, COVID gives us this wonderful opportunity to present to young people, well, here is the when instead of the if. Here is the when, and here's how you navigate a moment like this, and here's how you access resources, and here's how you can make sure that you're okay. On the flip side, we really have to make sure that teachers and parents and schools are well equipped to be able to help students navigate what's been a very trying moment that we've all experienced on a national level, global level, but also on a school community level. So bringing it back to the school community level, what are some things that schools can do, districts can do, teachers can do, students can even do to help improve not just the school environment, but really consider what policies should look like that will help students really be able to cope and bond and continue to learn and excel, knowing full well that there is some level of trauma that many young people have experienced or may be experiencing at this time. And how do we really give schools and teachers the resources and the skills that they'll need to really be able to support students once they're back in the classrooms? Again, acknowledging that this is a brand new and very novel moment that we're in and that many young people are in. So I'm super excited about today's guests. They can speak to these issues a lot better than I can. Our first one is Claudia Santi Fernandez. She's the Associate Director of the Play to Prevent Lab at the Yale School of Medicine. And her job is just as fun as it sounds. And then next we'll have Oscar Lopez. He is a staff attorney and clinical supervisor at the East Bay Community Law Center. But first, I want to go ahead and pull Claudia into the stream. Hey, Claudia, how are you?
Hey, Sasha, always a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I'm super grateful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you guys' work at the Play to Prevent Lab is pretty incredible. It's innovative, and it's at the same time, it's really in touch. So I'm hoping you could speak a little bit more about the Play to Prevent Lab, the work that you guys do, and even if you can a little bit, how COVID might be even impacting how you guys do your work right now.
Yeah, that's a great start. So the Play to Prevent Lab at the Yale Center for Health and Learning Games, we do really cool work. We design, develop, and evaluate video game interventions to help teens make healthier choices. And so every time I say that, people are like, wait, what? We create video games that help teens practice necessary skills that they can then develop and practice in real life. That's essentially what we do. So we know that over 97% of teens are playing video games. And as a result of so many teens playing video games, the mode of learning has changed and evolved because we rely so heavily on technology these days, and everyone has, 97% enjoy the video games. So why not meet them where they're at and use video games as our mode of learning and as a way that we can teach teens necessary skills in order to advocate for themselves, in order to feel empowered, and in order to practice discussions, conversations, things in a safe space to see, to develop that muscle and feel more confident so that when they go into the real world, they feel like they can do that there.
And a follow-up question I have, because in a lot of traditional health education curricula, you might have some type of role playing, right? Where you have students practice communication skills or some type of role playing skills. Could you speak to what the difference would be between traditional role playing skills and using, a game playing model to be able to practice different skills?
Yeah, so I can use an example in one of our games, Playtest, which is a game that empowers teens to access and utilize their school-based health centers. In that game, we have teens, because a lot of times teens see that they have school-based health centers in their schools. And we know that school-based health centers increase access to healthcare as well as decrease barriers to seeking access. So we know the value of school-based health centers, but there's been a little bit of a gap in teens seeking access. So through our game, we teach teens the skills by role-playing with a medical provider and talking about confidentiality, talking about starting that difficult conversation, because it's the anticipatory anxiety that can sometimes prevent you from doing something that could really help you and could really, show you that you do have the skills and you do have the ability to do that. So it's an interesting process, the way we operate with our games. The development process, and I can speak to that, of building games is informed by student voice at every step of the way. We have 3 stages. It's the design, where we conduct focus groups with teens, where I'll go into the schools, I'll sit with a group of like 5 to 6 teens, and I'll say, here's a topic we're talking about. Tell me about what you think about it. And then that information informs the storylines in our games, as well as the narratives to make it relatable, as well as the language, because teens use different language that's more applicable to their, my science jargon is not going to work for them.
Right.
We want to use their voices inside the game. And then we take our first stab at it and we build a prototype. After we build that prototype, we then take it back to teens. And we say, play through this prototype and tell me what you think about it. What's your experience of it? And teens love to be honest, and they love to share their thoughts freely.
And
they do. Like that, don't like that, take this out. That person would not be doing that. You wouldn't be doing this. This is real. This is not a real party scene. This is a real party scene. And then we take it again to build it out into a bigger game. So throughout each stage, while we're targeting within the game skill building and skill development, even the process of our game design utilizes student voice, because their voices are what matters most. We feel like the conductors, right? We're sitting there, but they're the ones who are making the music and the magic.
So now you're making me nerd out a little bit, because now, getting back to your metaphor, I'm wondering, what are the different notes that go into it? And I'm wondering, so there's so much information that you guys are able to glean from young people playing these games, and my mind has really been blown. I've really been working with like traditional pre-test, post-test surveys, focus groups, interviews. You guys are using video game data. And so how is that different from traditional kind of quantitative or qualitative data collection measures?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The third stage after the development phase is where we pilot test the game, right? And so now we go and see, did the game do what we said we wanted the game to do? And I didn't mention this, but our games are theory and evidence informed. So the research is infused in all of our interventions to ensure that, we're packaging it, and then we're packaging it with the student storylines to make it digestible, relatable, and that there's connectivity, right? Because we know that the more someone connects and relates to the storylines, the more they will identify and the more it'll have an impact on it. So going back to what you asked related to the science, what we then do is we, from the beginning, I mean, this is where early on we had determined measures, validated scales that we use that we intend to measure in the game. So when we build out that, intervention, it's always informed by the research and how to get to, either whether it's attitudes, knowledge, increase, intentions, behaviors. We're trying to improve those areas. And so that's behavior change theories that we use to inform that development. And so as a result, we have these constructs that we want to see, was this targeted? Did we do what we said we were going to do for this? And so the students will take a pre-survey, they'll play through the game, and then they'll do a post-survey. And so, for example, I can speak to, Tyler Pendergast just led our randomized control trial with playtest, which just recently finished. And as a result of that, that was teens took their, we went into schools, and it was approximately over 300 students who, one played playtest, and then a group played a control game, and they took, a survey, pre-survey, played the game over 5 sessions. So it was approximately, somewhere between 6 to 8 hours of gameplay. And then they take the post-survey to see if there was a change or a shift in any of those constructs. We are currently analyzing the data, and we're really excited to see, what comes of that. In addition to that information, we always connect with the groups too, and we conduct focus groups. And the reason we conduct focus groups is because data, I love data, we love data, but also sometimes focus groups paint pictures and allow teens to provide more information related to why they like the game or why they didn't like the game, or what they thought, with 2.0, how it could be improved and what their thoughts are. And so we always really value the focus group. A focus group is a discussion, just that space to allow teens the opportunity to talk about their experience too. And what's unique about this as well is that, in our process, we also help teens, we teach teens about research, and we teach them about the research design, through this process as well. So, I'm certainly grateful to our partner schools. They are just as much a part of our lab as I am.
And I'm sure that's got to be empowering for teens to be entrusted with being part of the research design and, being asked these questions, and then not just being asked and then you run off and you do your research and I, publish a paper, but, do the research, stay with them and continue to connect with them throughout the process and continue to ask for their reflections. And a question I did want to ask you, because as excited as we get about data, and I love it, I'm learning more and more that, connecting with the community that you want to connect with is also incredibly important. Connecting with them in the ways in which they want to be connected with it's pretty much just as important as how, effective in numbers your intervention is. And so I'm curious, how receptive have schools been, teachers been to, play tests, for example?
So thank you so much for asking that question, because as I actually come from an educator background, and I was in schools for 10 years. And so something that is so important to our team is really threaded into the culture of our team is that our schools are our partners. And so I'll speak to one school where, we were doing recruitment, and, I had a mic, and I'm walking through and I'm giving, shout outs to the students because they also have, a dance coming up, or, it's Valentine's Day and we're talking. And what's interesting is that, I spoke to one of the administrators who said, I think the kids think you work here. And my response was, that's exactly how it should be, is that this isn't us just coming in and focusing on the research. It's about building and developing relationships, because those relationships, quite frankly, do impact the research, how robust the research is, and how it speaks to, and again, I'll reference, our playtest game, we have to follow up with the students at 3 months, at different marks after.
Yeah.
Our team has such a bond with the students and with the schools that we get 100% response rate from, and I think that's so indicative, right? Instead of me just telling you, oh no, we're good. We're fantastic. You know, we have great partnerships with our schools. That to me, the fact that the kids follow up with our team, they have these relationships. Hey miss, how you doing? Like, hey, how's everything going? There's this connection between our team and the students, as well as the administrators and teachers in the school too, to the point where we are also asked to do community events, and we delightfully do them because that is part of our community. Right. So thank you for asking that, because I do think that is an important point, and I do think that speaks to the success of any research lab. It starts with community, it starts with connectivity, and it starts with building those bonds. Then the rest will come.
I mean, the nerd in me is kind of going off. My heart's aflutter. I'm happy to hear that. And Claudia, this is why. It's because you actually taught me a bit about the fact that, punishing young people or excluding them or removing them from the school community is not helpful. You want them to be able to build bonds. That's better for their mental health. It makes them more likely to actually access the services that are there at school when they're, able to actually build community and they're folded within the community. So I remember that conversation some time ago. And so to hear you say that is how your research has played out with your partner schools, just it's wonderful to hear you walk the talk. I'll put it that way.
Thank you. And that means it's not just me, it's our team. I'm in a unit that operates this way as well. And I think that's important too, that I'm not just the one person saying, hey guys, this is really important. It is embedded in the DNA of our entire team that matters to each and every one of us.
I love it. I mean, okay, so you guys also have another game as well. I know there's playtest, and then there's also Empower Ed.
Yes. So Empower Ed is currently, we're in the process of, analyzing the data with that as well. Empower Ed started as, it was a way to empower teens to create change in their school environment. And so what we focused on was cognitive reappraisal, to help teens, instead of like throw your hands up and be like, this is what it is, guess I have to accept it. Instead, reframe the language that you're telling yourself to then take action and improve your school climate. And so that is something that we are really, really, really excited to get the results on that. And more recently, this is the big boy, I like to call it. We have a huge grant. It's called the game is called Play Smart. And we are targeting opioid misuse among teens and young adults. And we just received an NIH grant. Well, actually, it's almost a year. We received through the Helping to End Addiction Long Term. And what we're doing, and so we are in the early developmental stages of this grant. And it has been really hard work, but also really, really inspiring and promising as we go out into the field and we do this work. So those are the two that we, want. The Empower Ed is being, evaluated at this moment. And then Play Smart, we are deep in it, deep in the formative work, deep into the design phase of it, which is really exciting.
One of the things that already excites me about Play Smart is just the language behind it. The fact that you guys are calling it an opioid misuse program or game versus an opioid prevention or opioid use. And a lot of my work is always around trying to remove the kind of moral value that people put onto drugs of any type of substance at all. There's nothing wrong with opioids at all, but the way in which they're distributed and a number of different reasons.
Yeah.
It makes it very easy to be, you know, addicted and become addicted and even dip into supplies that we now see are, you know, laced with very potent and deadly substances. So that's why we're so concerned.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that opioids are bad. And so I really respect the fact that you guys are saying opioid misuse. That's not what we want. We don't want that to happen, because I don't know if you've ever seen it in your work, but if you just say a word enough and you make it a bad word, teens tend to lock on to that. They're like, oh, opioid.
Yeah.
I think even to the extent, I know you guys did a little bit of testing, right, to see what young people know about opioids.
Yeah. So we are in the design phase. And when we're in the design phase, what we do is we go out to teens and we say, what do you know about opioids, right? And through a focus group. And so when we went out to say, hey, what do you know about what do you know about opioids? A lot of the students immediately knee-jerk response, opioids are bad. We know they're bad. They're not around us. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. And then we take out our one pager that has a list of different types of opioids. And it also has slang terms that we've learned from, you know, numerous people on what potential terms could be used to call, you know, opioids. Yeah. And they're like, I didn't know Vicodin was an opioid. I didn't know Oxy was an opioid. Oh, lean. Lean is a drink. It's Sprite with codeine poured in it and Jolly Ranchers. Oh, I didn't know that was an opioid. So what we're learning in meeting with, you know, opioid naive students is that opioids are actually very prevalent in their lives. They just don't realize that what is an opioid. So there's a lot of misperceptions on what is an opioid. The second thing that you know, we've heard often is the theme of, yeah, I know it's bad, but it can't happen to me. It can't happen to me. And so these are things that, again, when you think about the opioid epidemic and you think about how many people it's affected, then our work becomes, how do we highlight the different stories and the different backgrounds to highlight that, you know, it can happen to anyone. And what we've been doing as well is we've been conducting interviews with those between the ages of 16 and 25 who are currently in treatment for opioid use disorder to get some understanding, right, from these two groups. Like, what do you wish you knew that you did not know? Like, what would you tell your younger self? And the common theme is, you know, learning and developing coping strategies, learning how to manage, not realizing, you know, how quickly things evolved and spun out. And so these are really important themes that we're sitting on, we're percolating and chewing and digesting so that we can relay this information into the game. Because our primary outcome in the game is to increase teens' perceptions of risk of harm. Because we know the research connects that to the likelihood of use. So that's why it's very important for us to highlight that their perception of risk of harm is great.
You made a number of really strong points. One around the lack of information and misinformation. I mean, really, it's just a lack of information. And when you have that dearth of language, it becomes very difficult to be able to say something different, right? Like, they didn't know what different opioids were, so they didn't know they had been exposed or, you know, possibly have even used in the past. When it comes to advocating for change, if you don't know that there's other alternatives and other alternative ways to, you know, to even conceptualize something, you're not going to. And when we talk about perception of risk, and it's a little bit of a slippery slope I deal with in my work, right? Because again, I very much embrace the fact that total abstinence with all drugs, or total abstinence of anything among all people at all times is unattainable, right?
Right.
So to speak to prevention or abstinence to some extent sometimes is very offensive. In many cases can be offensive. It is not even necessarily what's necessary, but that is the lexicon, and that's the language that a lot of people have. So even with the safety, when we would interview students and do focus groups with safety first, you would see them give us these very perfect scripted answers about, like, what do you think about drugs? And they're the worst thing, and abstinence only, and I'm a good girl, I'm a good boy. And then they, and then they go through
desirability, right?
Exactly. And then they go through the curriculum and they realize that there is the space to be able to articulate something different, and they typically do. They still, for the most part, want to keep a good impression, but they see that honesty can also leave a good impression as well, and also, take them a lot further where they need to go.
I think you just bring up a really good point, if you don't mind me. It's like, it goes back, and this is the work that I love. This is why I love conducting focus groups in general, is that, when you ask a question, it's yes, no, you usually get part of the answer, right? Yeah. But when you ask a student to share your story, that's when you get more of the story and information to answer that question.
Yep. Yep.
It's the stories. It's that information. And so you're absolutely right. And I want to just add to your point as well. Something that we've talked about pretty extensively is, advocating with your healthcare provider. Let's say if you're getting your wisdom teeth out, or if you're, you got injured in football, or you got injured in wrestling, or, something, advocating for different alternatives, to learn about them, to know. Mm-hmm. So when you are prescribed an opioid, right, and perhaps you do, but is there also something you can do in tandem, or is there something that you can, take, and then when the pain is still there, have something that, that whatever it may be. And I say that because I know that when we just had an interview with a treatment provider, and she talked about this concept of physical pain versus emotional pain, which was very powerful. And she said, in some cases, sometimes when some of her patients or clients who have been misusing opioids, first when they were prescribed an opioid, the transition, and she used an example of someone talking about Columbine specifically. And the example was when someone was, taking an opioid because they had a gunshot wound, right? Mm. But then continued taking it. The wound wasn't no longer as painful, but there was still an emotional trauma and pain that was there, and having difficulty in discerning those two. And that was a moment that, that was like a moment where my jaw dropped. I was like, wow, right? Because pain is subjective. And because pain, you can feel significant emotional pain too. And so that was an interesting, of thinking about advocating with your doctor, about when to transition, into other alternatives as well.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. And again, getting back to the fact that, a lot of the work of the lab is getting young people to access resources and giving them the skills to advocate with their healthcare provider. It's important, you learn that as you get older, that you can cope from physical pain, you can also cope from emotional pain, and those things can get blended often too. And I think it's important for young people there's no reason why they can't know that ahead of time, so that when they're in the case, that they know that they've experienced something traumatic, or even anything that they may be experiencing during COVID, they can adequately advocate for themselves and ask the right questions. And there's no reason why we can't give them those skills. Again, they are in a very palpable moment right now that they're going to need to cope from. So there's no reason to shield them from these things.
Absolutely.
All right, Claudia. I want to go on a bit more, but I'm going to take you out of the live stream real quick, and I'm going to bring Oscar in.
Fantastic.
See you in a second. Oscar, welcome. There you go. How you doing?
Thanks, Sasha. Hey, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, and I'm also super stoked to have you. I feel like right now is such a crucial moment that you articulate so well in terms of really considering how we take care of young people as they return back to school next school year. There's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of caveats, and there's a lot to really consider and a lot that could go wrong. But firstly, I'm hoping you could speak a little bit about your work at the East Bay Community Center and what it is that you guys do there.
Sure. Thanks, Sasha, and thanks for this opportunity. So at the East Bay Community Law Center, we represent young people throughout all of Alameda County. We're the largest legal service provider in Alameda County, right? So we have a housing team, an immigration team, a consumer economic justice team. I work on the education and juvenile justice team. And that means that for the most part, we're representing young people that have been pushed out of school. They've been recommended for expulsion. Often they've been arrested for something that happened at school. So we partner with the public defender's office to try to give them the best advocacy that we can. And often this means that we also have to advocate for young people in special education proceedings. We find that many of the young people that do get pushed out of school do have IEPs and have some needs that are more significant than other students, right? So we try to support those young people by adding additional supports and services into their IEPs.
And that's pretty incredible work. And if you could give a little bit more detail for those who aren't maybe engaged in education about what IEPs are, and kind of what access or what kind of tracking even that gives to a student.
Sure. So an IEP is an individualized education plan. It's basically a plan that identifies a young person's needs, right? Usually they have to go through some sort of evaluation to see if they have a disability or not. If they do, the families, right, the parent, the student, other service providers, and the school partner to create a plan to best support that young person, right? Which means, giving them a paraprofessional throughout the day, right? Someone that kind of works with them if the work is too challenging, right? It could mean modifying some of the assignments, making them shorter, right? Giving a young person more time to complete those assignments. In some cases, it could even mean making sure that a young person is connected with additional mental health services, right? Either within the school or through an outside agency. The IEP is tailored to that young person. So every IEP looks different, right? But it's all based on the needs of that young person. And the goal is to make sure that that person has an opportunity to be just as successful as their peers in school, right? That they have just as much of an opportunity to graduate from school, to go to college, to have a successful, life in terms of employment and just their future in general, right?
Mm-hmm. But just to make sure I heard you correctly, so I'm getting a little feedback, I think, from your side. But just making sure that I'm understanding the context and that everyone understands the context more clearly. Students who have IEPs and who have specific and specialized needs tend to be pushed out of the school system more often.
That's right. Unfortunately, what we see is although students with disabilities make up about 13% of students throughout the country, there are about 26% of students that get pushed out of school, right? Wow. And often when I get a case, the first thing I want to do is I want to review that student's IEP if they have one to see if there are any needs that were being unmet, right? So before a school district can push a student out, if they have an IEP, we're supposed to review their IEP to see if the school unfortunately failed to implement it, right? So for example, if a young person was entitled to mental health services, but wasn't receiving those mental health services, right, that could be a reason to keep that student in school, right? That would prevent the school from recommending that young person for expulsion, right? But unfortunately, what we see is that it is true that students with disabilities are more likely to get recommended for expulsion than their non-disabled peers. When you review some of the juvenile justice data, you see that a really significant portion, in some cases, as much as 75% of young people in the juvenile justice system have disabilities, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed, right? And so we know that there's there's several issues at play here. There's race, there's disability, there's ageism often, right? So it adds layers to the school discipline context. And, you know, as you mentioned earlier, there are health disparities, but there are also disparities within our public education system, right? The way that schools have been funded for a long time has largely fallen along the lines of race, right? So we know that often the students that get recommended for expulsion are the ones that are attending schools that are underfunded in the first place, right? So as in a school, in a suburban school that has majority white students with several resources available, if a young person engages in misbehavior, they might get connected to counseling, right? They might get connected to some sort of mental health services. Their IEP might be revised for more paraprofessional support. But if you're attending a school without those resources, most likely the tool that will be used will be exclusionary discipline, right? So we try to work with schools as much as possible to prevent that and to really engage in the conversation about alternatives to exclusionary discipline that are more research-based.
And I appreciate, thank you for packaging that so well. And I really appreciate the fact that in the language of punitive exclusionary approaches, because right now we're kind of in an exclusionary moment. We're in an isolating moment, and we are very concerned about each other. We're concerned about young people. However, we feel like that might be an appropriate tactic to try to, you know, curb student behavior that we don't like, is by being punitive and being exclusionary, even though we are in real time concerned about the mental health consequences and ramifications that can be had by that child or even that child's family. So right now we're actually reflecting with greater depth in ways that are a lot more codified into school policy. And I think in my opinion, a bit more rinse and repeat in terms of the ways in which justice tends to be carried out or not for students, especially those that are underserved. One of the things that I'm curious about and that I learned from you about, right, is that, you know, we have a lot of young people at home. They are developing their own coping skills right now. Hopefully they've gotten enough education ahead of time to, you know what's good and what's bad and have the self-agency to lean into the good stuff. But there might be very likely some students who have, you know, developed maladaptive coping skills, be it in, you know, their behavior and how they act out, or even, you know, the fact that they're using drugs now. And as you know, most schools have a zero tolerance drug policy, meaning that, you know, it's punitive and exclusionary typically, and there's no tolerance at all for it. So I'm wondering a bit if you could speak to what are some of your concerns for students returning to school next year, and what are some of the narratives that you've heard from teachers, school districts, or even juvenile justice representatives during this moment of COVID?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Sasha. I think it's really important to start thinking about what will happen once schools reopen, right? Once businesses reopen and people can engage with life as close to normal as possible, right? Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I've been hearing in a lot of circles is that educators are really concerned that when young people return, they will have even more significant needs than before the schools closed, right? And I think that's actually true, right? I think that young people, anyone that's going through, you know, the shelter-in-place orders and is disconnected from the normal communities that they would be a part of, is living through trauma, right? And we can't anticipate the way that that's going to manifest itself for any individual, right? Unfortunately, I think that conversation has been creeping into a conversation about bad parenting, right? And I think this is a narrative that's existed for a really long time within the public education system, right? That there's often parents and teachers are really pitted against each other, right? Of, you know, especially in schools that are underfunded, right? It's who's responsible for a young person being 5 grade levels behind, right? Right? Is it the parent? Is it the teacher, right? But often we ignore that it's a structural issue, right? but it does create this tension. And unfortunately, what I've been hearing a lot from judges, from district attorneys, from educators, is that they're really worried that young people are not safe at home, right? And there may be situations where that's true, right? But that narrative, as a general narrative, I think is really problematic, and I think could lead to some really harsh approaches when young people return to school next semester, right? So I think I've heard some school districts already start thinking about these narratives and how they can address trauma when young people do come back to school, right? So I know that there's some school districts that are proactively reaching out to families, right? And they are starting to have conversations about what it would look like once a young person returns, right? Maybe trying to give families a little bit more support in this time. But we also know that there are school districts that are relying on law enforcement, right? There was a story that came out last week about police officers checking in on young people that haven't logged into their distance learning, right? And it's bringing, unfortunately, more contact between law enforcement and young people, and the research just doesn't support that practice, right? Heard rumors that Child Protective Services is also checking on families if young people haven't logged into distance learning, right? And you can imagine who this is going to impact the most, right? So I think, like you said, it's really important to take a trauma-informed approach, right? To realize that not everyone is at the same place, right? Some people may have more resources to deal with this moment than other families, right? Be aware of that. And when we are talking about discipline and accountability, I think that has to be a major factor, right? Ignore the realities of the situation, right? And that we still live in a country that has really significant disparities, right? So because of that, I would really recommend that school districts rely on some alternatives. And I know there's a great organization out of LA Public Council that put out a manual for educators, right? So that they can look at what other school districts are doing, right? That and look at the research behind the practices that other school districts are implementing, and really try to utilize those practices in their own school district, right? And I'm really grateful for Claudia for all of the programs that she's utilizing, and for what it sounds like a real mindset shift in the schools that she's partnering with, right? And I think that's what we also need in a lot of school districts throughout the rest of the country.
So I'm sharing that manual with the audience right now, the Fixed School Discipline Manual, because you shared that with me, and I found that to be a pretty invaluable resource. Again, it's the idea that it's an alternative way to really conceptualize how to deal with the issues within your own school community. So it gives so much more power and access and agency for schools to really decide how they want to, take on how, their school discipline, their school discipline in general. So I hope folks check that out. I think it's incredibly powerful. It's simple, but it's also very powerful.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really want to highlight about what Claudia said is that in a lot of the schools that she's working in, everyone at the school is supportive of the frameworks that she's implementing there, right? That it comes from leadership, it's the line staff, right? It's the students, right? Everyone is bought in, right? But I'm sure Claudia can tell you that it takes a really long time to get to that point, right? Where everyone is bought in. And so this manual that was put out, it's a really great resource that highlights some practices that are research-based, right? But there's one thing, there's one thing to putting out a manual with research-based practices. It's a completely other thing to shift your mindset to actually implement those practices, right? And I think sometimes that's the struggle, right? Yeah. We know that there are research-based practices, right? But unfortunately, because of a multitude of reasons, those practices may not be implemented, right? So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'd love to hear from Claudia how she changed that mindset at the school she partners with.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear from her too. If I can bring Claudia back into the stream. I'm getting the nod.
First of all, can you hear me? It's echoing a little bit.
Yeah, Oscar, could you do us a favor? If you turn down your volume a little bit, I think we'll have a little bit less echo.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Oscar, I'm sitting in the back room, and as soon as you said, I'm sure Claudia can speak to these relationships, I'm like, yes, exactly. And it brings me to a point that someone who I really admire, and I saw her speak, Althea Brooks. She said she was at New Haven Public Schools for a while, and now she's a Believe in Waterbury. She said progress moves at the speed of trust, and that always resonated with me, because that's the reality of it, is that progress moves at the speed of trust, and trust takes time to develop. So when you say, these relationships with schools, we didn't just come into the schools and say, hey, and then had it up and running within a week or two. These relationships have started first. We meet with the administrators. Then we let them sit. We provide information. Then we have another conversation to answer any questions they may have before we even get inside the school. If they're interested, many of the schools have to go through their boards. So we'll have to go through that process. In addition, we're working with school-based health centers. So we're operating through their organization as well, meeting with them as well. And, I will say that it has taken anywhere from 6 months to 18 months to develop really strong partnerships. And, I laugh because when we first go in, it's everything is do this, do that, go to the front, and now I go to the school and it's like, Claudia, come on in, go to the lunchroom. Sure, sounds great. There's this because they know me, because I'm a familiar face. The kids know me. They walk by, hey miss, how you doing? Hey, I'm good, how are you? We are part of the school community. And I think that's what, and we have people who are champions of our work inside the school community who we've developed relationships with. And it could range from people with school-based health center, people who are, administrators, teachers, different roles inside the school. We have them advocating for us too. It's like, oh, this is really, we've seen what they do. We know what they do. We see how the students respond. Yeah. Let's get them. Let's do this project. Let's do another project with them. So again, I think it's really rooted in trust and taking the time to develop that trust. So thank you for asking that question, because it's an important one too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And unfortunately, I usually come into the picture when there is no trust, right? Usually, I'm the once the young person has already been recommended for expulsion, right? And I find that it's really difficult to change a school administrator's mind once they've made up their mind that they don't want that young person in their school anymore, right? So, I unfortunately feel like I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage in trying to build that relationship, but I'm glad that there are others that are doing that, Claudia. And I think it brings up another really important point, that there are so many great community-based organizations, right? And universities that are willing to partner with school districts, right? And so one thing that I was talking to Sasha about was for school districts to really map the resources that are available in their community. We know that budget cuts are going to happen, right? Already in California, we're projecting that there will be an $18 billion budget deficit for education alone, right? So school districts are going to have to get really creative with the resources that they have, but are going to have to seek outside resources too to support their young people, their students, right? And I know that there are several community-based organizations that are ready, right? And they're willing to partner with school districts and with probation departments, right? So I would really encourage, all school districts to really take that approach, right? To try to partner with those CBOs, because it could be a really valuable asset, especially in this moment.
Yeah, and to add to that too, I mean, our team does incredible work with the National School-Based Health Alliance, as well as, at least in our community here in Connecticut, local school-based health centers. And school-based health centers are such an incredible resource to our students. And some are, right on site, which is fantastic. But some are also in the community, right? And so I encourage people to look into those for support services, in healthcare, and also some, I believe if they're DPH funded, are also do have someone who focuses on mental health, which is an important aspect here. And I think even again, this is where like the games come in, and this is where I love the work that we do, because there's this resource, but again, having those conversations in those focus groups, what we learned, there is a stigma around seeking help. And so I think it's our jobs as adults to destigmatize seeking help when you need a little support. And to encourage, I'm really a big advocate. And when I was working in schools, I started, an ambassador program, which was essentially a peer-to-peer support to be the eyes and ears. And I worked with high school students. And so it's important to empower my students to encourage their peers to seek help, to encourage their peers in a supportive manner, how to navigate, and then also recognize when it's time to go to, someone who's trained in this area. And that's really, that's really, that's something that our team has certainly talked about pretty extensively. And in fact, Lynn Feline, the director of our lab, she also, is really passionate about mental health, the work in this field as well, to make sure that it's infused in our work and, in our trajectory.
Absolutely. I mean, and you partly just answered, you just gave an example, but I want to play devil's advocate with you both just a little bit. A lot of school districts may be losing some money, but we also know that a lot of nonprofits and a lot of community-based organizations will be losing some money too, and have to reconsider, where they're getting their funding from, or even which services and how they provide their services. So a lot of school partnerships, may change as well. So let's say that may be the case for a school. What are some suggestions that you have for them for how they could, help build a sense of school community that's more inclusionary, less punitive, and really does recognize the needs of all students at this time?
Yeah. Oscar, do you want to go? Do you mind if I take a stab at this?
Go ahead, Claudia. Go ahead.
It's so important when you're inside those walls of the school, and sort of the walls of the school at this moment in time, but you're going through similar experiences together. So you have that shared experience. And so my encouragement, what I would encourage schools to do is to think about setting up peer-to-peer support pods with, a teacher, where it's a place to just, talk about what's on your mind, just check in with each other, do, quick emotional check-ins. It doesn't have to be something like a big, huge, okay, we're going to do this for an hour and a half. It should be something where we just check in with each other. We just check in, we check the temperature of one another. And then if the school sees that more support is needed, that, hey, I'm noticing so-and-so is acting a little bit different from how they usually act, then that's an opportunity for, the administration to think about how to, again, with the trauma-informed lens, to support that student in navigating this new space, because there will be different tiers of support that will be needed throughout this, right? There's different tiers of support. Some will be more crisis focused, some will be, perhaps like, you know, just being isolated in general. It'll be very different for everyone, but it doesn't negate the fact that everyone is still experiencing some form of disconnect and disruption to their lives.
Right. Yeah. I think I have a couple of suggestions. One thing that I realized, we're doing some asset mapping right now with some of our community-based organization partners. And what we're realizing is that there are certain agencies that are the go-tos for school districts, for probation departments, right? But there's so many other community-based organizations that are completely untapped, right? And they are, you know, again, ready and willing to support young people. They have a proven track record of doing that, often without any contracts, right, with school districts or with probation, right? But they're also some of the most radical organizations out there, right? They have a political lens to the work that they do, and that may speak to why they don't receive some of these contracts, right? But I think it's important to reevaluate, you know, the metrics, the rubrics that, you know, agencies are using to award these contracts, right, to service providers, because maybe they need to be modified a bit, right, to give other CBOs an opportunity to demonstrate that they can do this work as well, right? So I think that's one thing that comes to mind. The other one is that, you know, in the work that we do, there's often a pattern, right? We see referrals from one school very often, and we never see referrals from another school ever, right? And sometimes they're serving the same exact like demographic, right? And so I think what it brings to mind is that there are some schools that are operating with basically the same amount of resources, but their practices look different, right? I think it comes down to the leadership, right? The principals, the school administrators have created a different culture at those schools, right? And you know, I think often, I hate to do this, but you know, often those principals are doing an amazing job, but they don't have an opportunity to speak with other principals, right, about their approaches, right? They already have so much on their plate, right? And it's one of those things where sometimes we like put more on people's plates if they're doing really good work, right? But I think this is the time to do that, right? I think it's important to look at those principals, those schools that do have good practices, that do have good culture, and ask them to partner with other schools that may not, right? And to kind of coach them a little bit, right? How did you create that culture within your own school? It's always more powerful, like Claudia said, to have peers telling you how they implemented a certain policy, a certain practice, right? To talk to you about the challenges and how they overcame those challenges. So I would really, you know, encourage those principals that have good practices to reach out, look at the data in your school district, right? And maybe reach out to other principals that may not have great data.
Those are two excellent points and two excellent pieces of advice. I want to ask you both one last final question. And if you could give one piece of advice to young people to make sure that they're equipped to thrive and advocate for their needs next school year, what would that advice be?
Your voice matters. I drill this. It's whatever you like, your voice matters. Use your voice. The more that you use your voice, the more you'll get more comfortable using your voice, and the more you will share and people will hear you, so that it will gain traction to have an impact. So use your voice. Your voice matters. And I say that as an educator, as a counselor, and you know, now as a scientist at the lab.
Yeah, and I echo that. You know, I think advocate for yourself, right? And if you have a hard time doing that, advocating for yourself, especially, you know, sometimes there's a power imbalance between you and the principal or a teacher, right? Find someone that you can trust at your school site, right? Or outside of your school site that can be your partner with you when you're advocating for yourself.
Absolutely. Amazing. I appreciate that so much, y'all. Thank you. I want to go ahead and take a look at the episode takeaways. I'm going to keep you here in screen with me so y'all can snap, clap, or add in as you need to or feel compelled to. But the very first one, my advice would be take a look at your school's drug policy. Be it you as a student, oftentimes it shows up in the, what is it called? The agendas, the planners that you're often given at the beginning of the school year. Many, many times your school drugs policy is in there. Take a look at it. In fact, the Safety First curriculum has an entire lesson that's dedicated, well, it's actually kind of two lessons. It's dedicated to taking a look at your school's drug policy, but first we give students some backing in what is zero tolerance and where does that get anybody, which is, you know, it's exclusionary, it's punitive, and it often it usually doesn't achieve the result we want, and usually you know, what's seeking to be achieved is abstinence. It usually doesn't happen. And we also teach them about restorative justice approaches. And so after teaching them kind of the two ends of the spectrum, we have young people take a look at their own school's drug policy and they get to decide for themselves, do we feel like that's fair? Do we feel like that's missing the mark? Do we feel like it's on point? Do we feel like that's actually going to contribute to the wellness of one of our peers? And do we feel like that's actually going to contribute to the wellness and the vibrancy of our school culture? And so it's an excellent moment of reflection for both students and teachers in those learning moments. But you can do that at any time. You can take a look. You can probably even Google your school's drug policy right now. Really take a look and see if you think that it's fair, and see if you think if there's some room to be able to improve it and update it. Because I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of children who go to school or return to school and, you know, they're using substances to cope. And we need to make sure that teachers and school administrators are equipped with a harm reduction, trauma-informed, and compassionate lens to be able to deal with that versus punishing kids. And then again, you know, getting folks into the habit of criminalizing people for maladaptive behaviors, which we already know criminalization helps no one. In fact, it exacerbates the very thing that it is that we try to squash. Like Oscar and Claudia already spoke to, school districts should be aware of what resources are available in their communities. There may very likely be some budget cuts, or even if there's not budget cuts, there might be increased need that can't be completely maintained within the capacity of the school. So take a look at what's available within your community. And I think, Oscar, you made a great point around, like, look at other organizations too, not just the go-tos who are probably, if I can be frank, who are probably leaning on old methods that they've done before, are probably less innovative than the more radical organizations who have probably already had some type of solution that is relevant to this moment anyway, because they were already thinking of all the different ways in which these issues intersect. So really do, you know, take a look at other grassroots organizations, other innovative organizations and programs that are already doing the work versus maybe looking to more traditional organizations and resources. So this is a quote I actually got from you, Oscar, and I think you also took it from somebody else. But I believe that you explained this point a bit more fluently than I do. And so if you wouldn't mind, I hope that you could speak to there's a difference.
Yeah, I did. So I learned this. I'm a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and there's a People of Color Caucus within the National Lawyers Guild. And a few years ago, I was at an event, and someone had said something that had caused harm to someone else within the group, right? And in that moment, I think the immediate reaction was to call that person out, right? But after we had some time to reflect, we realized that there's a different way to hold each other accountable, right? There's a way to call someone out, right? But there's also a way to call someone in, right? And I think that also applies to school discipline, right? When a young person causes harm, right? You can take a trauma-informed approach, or you can take a punitive exclusionary approach, right? You can push someone out, or you can pull someone in, right? And I think especially in this moment with the context that we're living in, I think it's really time to lean into pulling someone in.
Absolutely. And absolutely. Very well said, Oscar. Thank you. And then the last one is, I think, a lot of the work of the Play to Prevent Lab. And it's the fact that young people need safe spaces to be able to practice their skills and make mistakes and, you know, see the consequences of their decisions and make a different one. And, you know, it's not really worth it to have things be so high stakes right now, especially in terms of punishment. It's not really going to be helpful for anyone. We really do need to channel all of our resources into being well and maintaining wellness. We don't have a lot of space to, you know, scapegoat and make people bad guys. Claudia, I don't know if you want to speak more to this point a little bit, and about how the lab really opens up that space for young people to really think about a new way forward, a new way that they can do things after having some, you know, space to practice with the games.
Yeah, absolutely. We know just from the science that, you know, young people, youth are curious, and that experimenting and risky behaviors is normal for all of our youth, right? And so knowing that, I know that our youth enjoy playing our games because they're able to see, well, what would happen potentially if I went down this route, and then see what could potentially happen versus in real life, if, you know, not experimenting and not knowing, but and preventing it because you did it in a safe space.
Right.
So that's the beauty of video games, is being able to live through the experience, but not in real life. And that's very powerful for our youth. And that's something that they have constantly told us that they have enjoyed doing, and that they've learned from, wow, I didn't think it could happen like that. Just because of that, this small decision somehow trickled out into, you know, a more serious situation.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think it's such a perfect space that you guys' games offer. It's such a perfect safe space. I hope more and more people download because they're free, right?
Absolutely. So Smokescreen and Play Forward Elm City Stories, they are both free. There's information on our websites you can download. We also have an app for Smokescreen. Smokescreen is part of the Be the First, smoke-free generation with CVS, funded by CVS Health Foundation. And so it targets vaping and smoking, and Play Forward Elm City Stories targets risky sexual behaviors. And so these are phenomenal games and opportunities for students to just dive into a space and a place that they know, and learn and practice these skills. I think one of my favorite things from this work is hearing from students about their experience with these games. And it's always, oh, that was so awesome. That was so cool. And, it's great because they're learning something, and it doesn't feel like a traditional way of, learning, because it's not. So it's really, and we know from our research and from our papers too, that there has been increased knowledge. There have been increased beliefs related to vaping and smoking. And so that's very powerful as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we're at the top of the hour, a little bit beyond the hour right now. I really want to thank you guys again for coming on and speaking to the myriad of ways that anyone can advocate for change within the school system. Next week's episode is going to be about harm reduction for parents and teachers. So what does that look like? How can you be an advocate? And I really just want to thank you guys again. It was awesome.
Yeah.
It was awesome to speak to
y'all.
Thank
you for bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, so much too. I enjoyed learning about your work as well.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure for all of us. I hope it was a pleasure for everyone who watched today. I hope you tune in next week. And as always, thanks for viewing and tuning in today. So everybody take care. Be well.
Be well.
Till next time.